The woman who threw me out of her life when I was 13 walked into my grandfather's while reading 15 years later, convinced she was about to become rich. She had no idea the next 5 minutes would destroy the lie she'd been living with for over a decade. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Brynley Vaughn, and when all of this began, I was just 13 years old. I lived with my parents, Coulter and Marlo Vaughn, in a quiet part of rural Ohio. From the outside, we looked like a normal family, but inside our house, things were very different. My parents always treated my younger brother, Huxley, like he could do no wrong. They praised him for everything, even the smallest things. I was expected to stay quiet, work hard, and never complain. No matter what I did, it never seemed good enough for them. The only person who truly made me feel loved was my grandfather, Ellsworth Vaughn. He listened when I talked, remembered the little things that mattered to me, and always reminded me that my value didn't depend on anyone else's opinion. Whenever life at home became too heavy, I looked forward to spending time with him because he made me feel safe. Then one ordinary afternoon, everything changed. My parents suddenly realized that a large amount of the family's savings had disappeared. The house filled with panic and anger. Questions were asked, voices became louder, and everyone looked for someone to blame. Before I even understood what was happening, fingers were pointed at me. I kept telling them I hadn't touched the money, but nobody wanted to hear my side. Huxley spoke with complete confidence, and my parents believed every word that came out of his mouth. They didn't ask for proof. They didn't stop to think. They simply decided I was guilty. I begged them to listen, but every sentence I spoke seemed to make them even angrier. My grandfather tried to defend me, saying they were making a terrible mistake, but they ignored him too. Then my mother looked me straight in the eyes and said I was no longer part of the family. My father stood beside her without saying a single word to stop it. Those few seconds changed my life forever. They handed me one old duffel bag, told me to pack what I could carry, and sent me out the door. I stood there holding that bag, trying to understand how my own parents could throw away their daughter so easily. As the door closed behind me, I honestly believed my life was over. I didn't know where I was supposed to go after leaving my parents' house, but my grandfather never gave me the chance to feel alone. He picked me up that same evening and took me to his home. He didn't ask me to explain what had happened because he already knew I was telling the truth. He simply told me I was safe and that I could stay with him for as long as I needed. For the first time in days, I slept without hearing angry voices through the walls. Even then, I couldn't stop wondering why my own parents had given up on me so quickly. A few days later, my grandfather quietly told me something that answered the question I had been asking myself. Huxley had taken the missing money. He had made a dangerous mistake and needed cash to cover it before anyone found out. Instead of admitting what he had done, he let everyone believe I was responsible. My grandfather had figured it out after putting together small details that nobody else cared to notice. He tried more than once to tell my parents they had blamed the wrong child, but my mother refused to hear him. Every time he defended me, she cut him off and said the matter was already settled. She insisted Huxley would never lie to them. My grandfather warned her that one day the truth would come out, but she turned her back and walked away. My father stayed silent through every conversation. He never stood beside me, and he never questioned the story he had been told. That silence hurt almost as much as my mother's words. I kept asking myself the same question every night. Why wasn't I worth one more chance? Why didn't they want to hear my side? Those thoughts stayed with me for a long time. My grandfather noticed the pain I carried, but he refused to let it control my future. Soon after, he became my legal guardian so nobody could force me back into the same situation. He told me that life would keep moving forward whether I was ready or not, and that I had to decide what kind of person I wanted to become. He never taught me to hate my family. Instead, he taught me to stay honest, work hard, and keep my heart strong even when people treated me unfairly. Little by little, I started believing that I could still build a good life. The hurt didn't disappear, but it became easier to carry. One quiet night, I made a promise to myself without saying it out loud. I would never spend another day begging for love from people who had already chosen to walk away from me. If they couldn't see my worth, I would learn to see it for myself. Life did not become easy overnight, but it slowly became more peaceful. I focused on school because it was one place where my past didn't decide who I was. Every good grade reminded me that I was capable of more than the lies people believed about me. My teachers noticed how serious I was, and they encouraged me to keep pushing forward. I spent long evenings studying instead of thinking about everything I had lost. There were still moments when old memories came back, but I refused to let them stop me from moving ahead. My grandfather believed that real success came from being able to stand on your own feet. He taught me how to manage money, save for the future, and never spend more than I earned. He showed me how to fix small things around the house, prepare simple meals, and solve problems without waiting for someone else to rescue me. He always said that independence was one of the greatest gifts a person could have. Those lessons stayed with me every single day. As high school came to an end, I worked harder than ever because I wanted to earn my own future. All those late nights and extra effort paid off when I received scholarships that covered my college education. It felt like someone had finally opened a door that had been locked for years. I chose to study architecture because I loved the idea of creating places where people could feel safe and welcome. Designing buildings gave me a sense of purpose that I had never felt before. College was challenging, but I enjoyed every chance to learn something new. With every semester, I became more confident in my abilities. The scared 13-year-old girl who had once believed her life was over slowly disappeared. In her place stood a young woman who trusted herself and wasn't afraid to work for her dreams. During all those years, my parents never reached out to me. There were no birthday cards, no phone calls, no holiday visits, and no letters. It was as if I had never existed in their lives. At first, that silence hurt, but over time, I accepted it for what it was. I stopped waiting for something that was never going to happen. I also heard small pieces of news about Huxley from people who still knew the family. Everyone continued treating him like he could do no wrong. But behind that perfect image, he had started gambling. The habit grew worse every year, though he worked hard to keep it hidden from my parents. They still believed he was the successful son they had always defended. They had no idea that the same person they trusted without question was creating even bigger problems that would not stay hidden forever. Several years passed, and my life kept moving forward. I stayed focused on my career and worked harder than I ever had before. After gaining experience with different companies, I finally opened my own architectural design firm. It started with only a few clients and a small office, but I treated every project with care and respect. Slowly, more people heard about my work, and my business began to grow. Every success reminded me that I had built this life through my own effort. I didn't owe it to luck or to anyone who had once doubted me. While my future became brighter, things were going very differently for my parents. I learned through relatives that they had started facing serious financial problems. Bills kept piling up, and the savings they had worked for over many years seemed to disappear little by little. At first, nobody outside the family knew why. The answer was much simpler than anyone expected. Huxley had become even more careless with money. He made one bad decision after another, always believing he could fix everything later. Instead, every mistake only made things worse. He kept asking for help, and my parents continued giving him money because they still believed he would eventually turn everything around. They trusted him without asking difficult questions. Each time they helped him, their own savings became smaller. There were moments when the truth about the money that disappeared years ago almost came out. Someone would remember an old detail, or Huxley would nearly say something that didn't match the story everyone believed. Each time, the conversation changed before anyone looked deeper. My parents never wanted to question the past because doing so would force them to face the possibility that they had made a terrible mistake. It was easier for them to protect the lie than to search for the truth. I stayed away from all of it. I had my own work, my own goals, and my own life to live. My grandfather watched everything quietly. He visited my office a few times and smiled as he looked around. He never needed to tell me how proud he was because I could see it on his face. Seeing him happy meant more to me than any award or business success. He often told me that watching me build an honest life gave him peace. I didn't know that while all of this was happening, he had already started making an important decision. Without telling anyone, he met with his lawyer several times and began rewriting his will. He kept those meetings completely private. No one in the family suspected that he was putting plans into place that would one day change all of our lives forever. Not long after that, I started noticing small changes in my grandfather. He became tired more often and no longer had the same energy he once did. At first, he brushed it off and said it was just part of getting older, but the doctor visits became more frequent. Even when he wasn't feeling well, he still smiled whenever I came to see him. We spent as much time together as we could because I knew those moments were becoming more precious. One evening, while we were sitting on his porch, he asked me to stay a little longer because he wanted to tell me something important. He looked at me with the same calm expression that had comforted me since I was a child. He said, "Brinley, life doesn't always bring justice when we want it. Sometimes it takes years. But never believe that the truth loses its value just because it takes longer to appear. Justice may be slow, but it always matters." I listened carefully because I knew every word meant something. Then he told me there was something I needed to remember after he was gone. He said his will was not only about money or property. It was about leaving behind the truth and making sure the right people finally heard it. He didn't explain everything because he wanted me to hear it at the proper time. He simply asked me to trust him one last time. I promised that I would. A few weeks later, I got the phone call I had been afraid of. My grandfather passed away peacefully. The world suddenly felt much quieter. The man who had protected me, believed in me, and stood beside me when nobody else was gone. Losing him felt like losing the last piece of the family I had left. The days that followed were filled with sadness. I kept expecting to hear his voice or see him waiting with one of his gentle smiles. But I knew those moments now belonged only to my memories. As I tried to deal with my grief, something unexpected happened. After years of complete silence, my parents suddenly appeared again. They didn't come because they missed me or wanted to repair our broken relationship. They came because they had learned about my grandfather's death. Almost overnight, they started asking questions about his estate and when the lawyer would read the will. It was the first time I had seen or heard from them in many years. Their sudden interest made one thing painfully clear. They had ignored me for most of my life, but they had not forgotten that my grandfather owned valuable property. Watching them return only after he was gone told me everything I needed to know about why they had come back. A few days after the funeral, I arrived at the attorney's office for the reading of my grandfather's will. The waiting room was quiet, and everyone spoke in low voices. I took a seat and tried to prepare myself for another painful reminder that the person who had always stood beside me was gone. My only reason for being there was to honor his final wishes. I wasn't thinking about money or property. I just wanted to hear the last message he had chosen to leave behind. A few minutes later, the office door opened again. I looked up and froze. My parents walked in together as if nothing had ever happened between us. They didn't look embarrassed or ashamed. They acted like we were simply meeting after a short time apart instead of 15 years. My mother even gave me a small smile that felt completely fake. My father avoided looking directly at me, choosing instead to look around the room. Then Huxley stepped inside behind them. The moment I saw him, I noticed something different. He looked uneasy. He couldn't sit still and kept moving his hands. He avoided making eye contact with anyone for more than a second. It was clear that something was bothering him, even if nobody else seemed to notice. My mother, on the other hand, looked completely confident. She spoke with the attorney as though everything had already been decided. From the way she talked, it was obvious she believed she would receive a large part of my grandfather's estate because she had been his daughter-in-law for many years. She discussed family property like it already belonged to her. She even mentioned ideas about what should happen to some of his belongings before the meeting had officially started. I listened without saying a word. There was nothing I wanted to argue about. My grandfather had always taught me that staying calm was stronger than raising my voice. I remembered those words and kept my emotions under control. I simply sat in my chair and waited for the attorney to begin. The silence inside the room slowly became heavier. Every person seemed to be carrying different thoughts. My father looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Huxley became more restless with every passing minute. My mother remained certain that everything would go exactly as she expected. The attorney finally entered carrying a folder filled with documents. He greeted everyone politely before taking his seat at the front of the room. As he opened the file and adjusted his glasses, nobody spoke. The room became so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. I had a feeling that once the first page was read, nothing in that room would ever be the same again. The attorney cleared his throat and began reading my grandfather's final wishes exactly as they were written. His voice was calm and steady, and every word filled the room with even more tension. At first, he spoke about simple matters, including personal belongings and gifts for a few friends. Everyone listened quietly, but it didn't last long. My mother suddenly leaned forward and interrupted him. She wanted to know when he would start talking about the house, the savings, and the rest of the estate. The attorney politely asked her to let him finish reading the document in order, but she refused to stay quiet for long. Every few minutes she interrupted again with another question or another complaint. Her impatience became impossible to ignore. Finally, she pointed at me and said there was no reason for me to be included in anything. She reminded everyone in the room that I had been disowned many years earlier. She said I was no longer part of the Vaughn family and therefore had no right to receive anything from my grandfather. She spoke with complete confidence, certain that the law would agree with her. I remained silent. I didn't react because I trusted my grandfather's decisions. The attorney waited until she finished speaking before opening another page in the file. Without showing any emotion, he explained that there was an important legal document attached to the will. He placed it on the table and said that after my parents had forced me out of their home, my grandfather had gone through the legal process to become my guardian. Later, after receiving full custody, he officially adopted me according to state law. The attorney explained that from that day forward, I was no longer only his granddaughter in the eyes of the law. I had legally become his daughter. The room fell completely silent. My mother stared at the attorney as if she had heard something impossible. She quickly shook her head and insisted there had to be a mistake. The attorney calmly showed her the signed court documents, complete with official records and dates. There was nothing to argue about because everything had been done legally many years earlier. My father looked at the papers without saying a word. Huxley lowered his head even further. My mother's confidence disappeared in an instant. The certainty she had carried into that office was gone. She looked from the attorney to me, trying to find some way to challenge what she had just heard. But there was nothing left to question. My grandfather had made his choice long before this meeting, and he had protected that choice with the law. For the first time since I was 13 years old, my mother realized that the daughter she had thrown away had never truly been left without a family. After everyone had a moment to process the adoption papers, the attorney reached for another sealed envelope. He explained that my grandfather had written a personal letter with clear instructions that it had to be read aloud during the meeting. He carefully opened it and began reading. The first few lines were about love, family, and the importance of truth. Then his words became more direct. He wrote that he had never believed I had taken the missing money all those years ago. From the very beginning, he knew something was wrong with the story that had been accepted without question. He had watched everything carefully and spent time quietly gathering information because he wanted facts instead of guesses. He refused to let an innocent child carry the blame forever. The attorney then placed several old documents on the table. They included bank records, payment slips, and notes that my grandfather had collected over the years. Together they showed where the missing money had really gone. The records proved that Huxley had taken it 15 years earlier to cover a serious mistake he had made. My grandfather had kept every piece of evidence safe because he knew one day the truth would have to be faced. Nobody in the room spoke. Every eye turned toward Huxley. His hands started shaking, and he looked like he could barely breathe. For a long moment he tried to stay quiet, but the pressure became too much. He finally lowered his head and admitted everything. He confessed that he had stolen the money and had been too afraid to tell the truth. He admitted that he let everyone believe I was guilty because he wanted to protect himself. He said he never imagined the lie would destroy my life, but once it started, he was too scared to stop it. My father closed his eyes and covered his face with his hands. The weight of what he had heard was written all over him. He realized that he had believed one child without asking for proof and had turned his back on the other. He understood that he had sacrificed his own daughter because of a lie. The regret on his face was deeper than anything he could say. My mother reacted very differently. Instead of accepting what had happened, she immediately began blaming other people. She claimed my grandfather should have spoken sooner. She blamed Huxley for hiding the truth. She even blamed the attorney for reading the letter in front of everyone. She refused to admit that she had chosen not to listen when she had the chance years before. No matter what excuse she gave, nothing could erase the truth that had finally come into the open. The lie that had controlled our family for 15 years had ended, and there was no way to hide it anymore. Once the room became quiet again, the attorney continued reading the rest of my grandfather's will. He explained that my grandfather had left his home, his investments, and his business interests to me. It was not a decision made at the last minute. Every document had been prepared carefully, and everything was legally complete. My grandfather wrote that he wanted the person who had shown honesty, responsibility, and kindness to carry forward what he had built during his lifetime. I felt tears fill my eyes, not because of what I had received, but because I knew how much faith he had placed in me. He believed in me until the very end, and that meant more than anything written on those papers. The attorney then read the next part of the will. My parents were each left $1. Along with it was a short letter from my grandfather. In it, he wrote that money could be earned again, but trust was much harder to restore. Once trust was broken, it could not be passed down like property or placed inside a will. He hoped they would spend the rest of their lives thinking about the choices they had made instead of the money they had expected to receive. The room became silent once more. Then came the final decision regarding Huxley. He was left nothing. My grandfather wrote that rewarding dishonesty would only encourage more of it. Actions always have consequences, and this was one of them. Huxley said nothing after hearing those words. He remained in his chair, staring at the floor. I looked around the room and realized I didn't feel the happiness I had once imagined. I wasn't interested in watching anyone suffer. I didn't want to argue, insult anyone, or remind them of the pain they had caused me. There was nothing left to prove. The truth had finally been spoken in front of everyone, and that was enough. I quietly thanked the attorney for his time, collected the papers that belonged to me, and stood up to leave. Nobody tried to stop me. As I walked toward the door, I felt lighter than I had in many years. I wasn't carrying the weight of a false accusation anymore. The burden had finally been placed where it belonged. When I stepped outside, I took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. My grandfather had once told me that the best answer to cruelty was to build a life so full of peace that bitterness could never find a place to live. At that moment, I finally understood what he meant. My greatest revenge was never going to be hurting the people who had hurt me. It was living a happy, successful life without needing their approval, their forgiveness, or their acceptance ever again. Several months passed after the will reading, and life became quiet again. I returned to my work and focused on the future. One afternoon, I heard a knock on my front door. When I opened it, my father was standing there alone. He looked older than I remembered. The confidence he once carried was gone, and his face showed years of regret. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me and quietly said he was sorry. He admitted that he had failed me when I needed him the most. He said he should have listened instead of believing a story without asking questions. He told me he thought about that day almost every night and wished he could take it back. I believed his words because I could see the pain in his eyes. My mother never came with him. She still refused to admit that she had done anything wrong. According to other relatives, she continued blaming everyone except herself. Even after the truth had been proven, she could not accept responsibility for the choices she had made. Hearing that no longer surprised me. Some people would rather protect their pride than face the truth. I listened to my father until he finished speaking. I told him I was no longer angry with him because carrying anger would only keep hurting me. I forgave him in my heart, but forgiveness did not erase the past. Some wounds heal, but they still leave scars. I explained that I could not rebuild the relationship we had lost because too many important years were gone forever. He nodded slowly, understanding that some mistakes cannot be undone. Before he left, he thanked me for listening. We wished each other well, and he quietly walked away. That was the last time I saw him. I still live in my grandfather Ellsworth's home. Every room reminds me of the kindness, patience, and love he gave me when I had nowhere else to turn. His house is more than a place to live. It reminds me every day that real family is built through actions, not promises. When I look back, I know being abandoned at 13 changed my life in many ways. It forced me to grow up faster than I should have. It taught me painful lessons that no child should ever have to learn. But it never decided my value as a person. My worth was never based on whether someone chose to love me or not. I found people who believed in me, and most importantly, I learned to believe in myself. If my story has taught me anything, it is this. Sometimes the deepest betrayals come from family, but the strongest victories come from choosing dignity over revenge. The people who truly love you never have to be forced to believe in you, because real love always chooses trust before judgment.